Yes, I am. There's an examination going on, so we might still have people trooping in, so I hope that was not missed. Okay, dear friends, welcome to the 7th session of the Raganda Talks, lecture series by eminent personalities. Today is the last day of the term for most of us, and this is a great way to end it. We are privileged today to have with us an icon whom most of us have grown up watching and whose name has rolled up in the credit titles for more television serials than one can remember. Friends, I would like to welcome Ronnie Screwvala in our midst today. Come today, Ronnie. This is family. And Zarina Mehta, who is one of the co-founders of UTV, is also with us, who is incidentally Ronnie's wife. So, warm welcome to you as well. Thank you for spending time off from your busy schedule, Ronnie, and for this kind gesture towards the student community. One, which was India's first cable TV network. Ronnie has made UTV India's first corporate media house with full-fledged divisions catering to every aspect of the entertainment industry. Ronnie has also actively pioneered and contributed to television, animation, feature film, and broadcasting industries in India, Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Also, Ronnie is the founder of Share, which is a public service and charitable trust. An entrepreneurship side to him, he is the owner of India's largest toothbrush manufacturing company. I welcome you, Jian. Thank you for your patience. You may now begin.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's such a lovely, I was just being told about the history of this place, and I thought that was fascinating. Besides which, the fact that this is definitely by far our favorite city, and whenever the stress of Bombay gets to us, this is a place where actually your creative thoughts come to play. And I think some of the best ideas, the best origination of ideas, the best germ of ideas actually come from your peaceful surroundings. So I think for a campus in a university setting to be in a gorgeous place like Goa, I think you're all very fortunate to be part of this university. Because outside of your curriculum, anytime and every time you want to be inspired, all you need to do is look out of your window. And definitely, that's something you're going to get. So I think that's a lovely way to be. Excuse my very informal get-together, but and my apparel, but that was because primarily to us this is Goa. So I think again, to communicate and talk at any forum, at any place, you need to be dressed appropriately to represent the culture of that city. Abhijit, as one of your colleagues, had actually followed up with me quite some time back, and it was a little difficult at that time for me to come in, but this was very last minute. So I am, over the next half an hour, going to walk you through what I think are some of the interesting aspects of the entire media industry. For most people, media industry seems to be movies and feature films and therefore stardom. There will be representation that this is a growing and sort of unstructured industry where I think it's nice to watch it from outside. There's a sense of glamour to it. But can one actually build a career being in the media business? My simple answer to that, of course, is yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here today from that point of view. And more over the last 3 years, actually, many media companies, and media before this used to be just advertising agencies. Advertising agencies have been into campuses for almost a decade. But in the last 2 or 3 years, active companies and most of the spaces have really been coming into campuses, because I think it's important for the youth of India necessarily to be involved and look at this as an exciting and a different business opportunity. Most people, when they're looking at themselves and they reconsider their career options, whether at 25 and 26, when they reconsider their career options at 35 and 40, and when they almost sort of look back on their career options when they're about 50 or 55, look at the fact of whether they've been able to achieve the right mix in their work of what I would call joy at work, and at the same time being able to contribute. So you enjoy your work and at the same time you're building a professional career. And I think in some ways media really offers that as a very different and exciting opportunity. But yes, it's unstructured and therefore allows for a tremendous amount of innovation in the entire spectrum of what we're doing in media. So let me just take you first through the segments that I see, and I think since Abhijit started by saying 1981, when cable television started in India, and basically if you look at media by and large, it's sort of broken up into broad segments. There's the small screen, there's the big screen, and there's pipelines. So I'd rather use a little bit of management jargon than go into the soft issues of saying television content and movie content, because by and large, if you look at the entire media spectrum, the electronic media spectrum outside of the print, it is basically you're creating something with a small screen or you're creating something with a big screen, and everything else is about pipelines. And pipelines to us is distribution pipeline. So broadcasting is a pipeline, distribution of movies is a pipeline, exhibition of theaters and multiplexes is a pipeline. And each of these aspects, that's what you would do. Even if you take a business like animation, in many aspects it's a BPO service. So to most people, animation sounds like something that you see on Cartoon Network. But by and large, it is as much of a BPO process as American Express commissions people here to take phone calls and credit card responses. The same aspect is applied when you look at that. So starting off with the small screen, I think in 1981 is when pretty much cable television came into this country. And that's the reason why most of you all have found that there is a fair amount of proliferation in the broadcasting industry. The movie industry has been around for 110 to 115 years and is now about a 4,500 crore industry, which is about a $1 billion industry. The good news is that it's a 4,500 crore industry. The good news is also when you look at international spectrum, outside of the US, the second markets normally are Japan, and then a little bit of Europe, and then India plays a very, very dominant role in the entire cinema, not just because statistically we've had 800 movies and 900 movies coming out of this country, but primarily because of the simple reason that our ability to be able to follow that content and actually market it globally is becoming increasingly an interesting industry. But coming back therefore to the small screen, the broadcasting industry, which started off with just cable television, and I think we're one of the very unique countries in the world where cable television anywhere else actually means that a cable operator creates a network, subscribers pay for it, and he delivers content. And that content is a mixture of content that is originally created by cable channels for that cable network, and B, being a facilitator for satellite channels that are beamed down. In India, because it started off as a cottage industry in many senses of the word, primarily because regulations were a problem, but India being as innovative as it is, what actually happened was that there was really no regulation that actually stopped you from starting your cable industry, except for the fact that the Post and Telegraph Act prohibited anyone to run a cable across any public road. So essentially what you therefore found over a period of 10 years from 1981 to 1991 is a proliferation of more than 100,000 to 200,000 what we would call head ends, or centers where cable operators would work but would not cross municipal territories. So essentially there was no regulation. Anywhere else in the world, like we have done in the mobile industry here, the government tenders for a license for a particular locality. Based on that license and locality, people bid for it. You should have between 2 and 3 players because then you keep the pricing competitive. But once you've got a license for that territory, the cable operator has that for a period of 8 years, 10 years, 20 years. So his license fee plus what he pays the broadcaster is exactly what he needs to charge the consumer. Since none of that was out from that point of view, and when cable industry started here, it was your terrestrial network of Doordarshan, which in any case were a very different kind of a small dish antenna, which everyone remembers here. Till satellite came in, primarily with, to a certain extent in urban towns, with the Gulf War and CNN, people had a large level of intrigue, and therefore in 1991 with the Gulf War, you had a huge level of intrigue. And so urban penetration of dish, in that time, huge dish antennas started getting formed in cities. 1992 October is when ZTV decided that they want to launch an Indian channel. And that's when the first time people looked at alternative programs to at that time what was the terrestrial network, which was Doordarshan 1 and Doordarshan 2. So since that time, actually, what you found is nobody was looking at the consumer pay. At that particular point, the origination of broadcasting and the origination of cable was to be a facilitator. So essentially what we have today is very little regulation in the industry of what I would call the distribution levels, which is the reason why we've been able to A, have the kind of mushrooming of having 65 million cable homes homes, which is a staggering statistics if you look at it from that point of view. There are a total amount of 99 to 100 million television homes in the country. But here, of course, our pro rata of evaluating that is very different because you do have community sets in many of them. So it's not that if you have 100 million homes, necessarily that represents just 300 million population. It reaches a much more, and not close to a billion, but definitely close to 600 and 700 million as far as the television households are concerned. The cable households are 65 million households. If you look at that as the statistics, essentially what happened over a period of time is that you have that kind of proliferation, number one. Number two, you have the consumer now has a choice of between 150 to 180 channels, depending on where and how you're necessarily looking at things. And you're paying on an average between 60 to 75 rupees. Again, don't put benchmarks. If somebody is staying in Delhi or in Bombay or even Goa and you're paying 150 or it's different, but the country average is 75 rupees. Now that as a coefficient itself is too small. So essentially last year, the government brought about a very controversial bill, which was what they call the Community Antenna System, which is the CAS, and everyone was sort of getting worried about the fact that CAS was actually going to come in. But what it meant was that after 20 years of no regulation, we were going to introduce a regulation, and CAS actually meant that you as a consumer would have a choice. Basically, number one, that you were paying too little for the service that you were getting, which actually meant that the 75 rupees is what they considered to be the base price, where you would have all the free-to-air channels, which is about 18 terrestrial and Doordarshan channels. The Sahara network and many of the news channels are free-to-air. But today as a consumer, you're not even aware which channels are paid and which channels are free. There are almost 80%. You're only aware of that when cricket gets switched off and gets switched on. And that's a different coefficient because that's really the broadcaster, the cable operator finding out. So essentially, the reason I'm giving you this as the first analogy is that this television industry, which has now become presently between the 12,000 crore to 16,000 crore industry, as a combination of the aggregation of revenues from the broadcasters as well as the consumer paying the cable operators. That's the scale of the industry. It actually should be 3 times that. The television and broadcasting industry should actually be represented. The small screen should be representing, therefore, nothing less than 35 to 40,000 crores as a revenue opportunity. And the reason that's not is because the average bill that everyone should be paying for what you're receiving as part of your home entertainment is around 150 to 225 rupees, depending on how you look at that. Now that change, somebody has to necessarily fill the gap. I think the government tried to do that last year. There was a fair amount of rebuttal and lobbying, primarily because like anything else, it was done short-sightedly, and everyone was given a deadline of 6 months in which an entire nation that had cabled up and dealt with technology for 20 years needed to change it. That was not practical. But if they'd actually done it on a 2-year basis, that said 10 cities in the first 6 months and ramp up and ramp down, you would have actually found that this would have been a very, very different kind of industry. I think most of the custodians here are still very, very clear that this is something that's going to actually change the industry. And once you see that kind of money coming in there, it is a very, very interesting and a very large industry. So what I represent by 16,000 crores there is a combination of the content that is created for the broadcasters, the advertising revenues that the broadcasters are earning, and to a certain extent, the cable operators, and they're giving some of the revenues back to the broadcasters now. And I'm sure there are many other viewpoints as far as this is concerned. I'll be happy to take some more Q&As when we come back to this segment of the business. Going into content, most people in this industry are very, very clear that actually the key word in our industry is that content is king. And actually that means that content really drives demand. I think the best example that all of you all again can understand this industry of why, and you can relate this to almost any other industry that you're looking at, that there has to be almost one critical aspect in any aspect of the business, whether it's in steel, or whether it's in oil rigging, or whether it's in shipping. If you look at the media industry, content creates the demand. Let me give you a small example. Almost, I think, 5 years back, you had a half-an-hour news segment on, at that time, there was one of the channels called Star World, which at that time hadn't even converted into Hindi, maybe about 7 years back. Total revenues from that was about 25 to 30 crores. And from all points of view, as a consumer, one would think there was a good enough spotlight for everyone to see and get a general overview of what the news was. And then you had some international news, which is what CNN, BBC, wherever you could get them in overseas. In 7 years, you now have almost 12 to 13 Hindi channels and another 6 news channels. That's 18 channels, A, B, 24-hour compared to that half-hour band. So the question is, it's come about because there is a need. Content has created that demand. More and more people have figured out that this is what I want to hear. When I want to see it, I want to see it now. I want to see it interactive. I want to see breaking news. I want to see segments. What I read in the newspaper and what I would read in an article from the editorial person that talks about a particular, now is being discussed on a big fight where issues are constantly being done. So current affairs, business news. Today, the stock market is booming. I would say that outside of the fact that in the last 6 months there's been a boom, the gradual growth of the entire stock market, and believe me, the stock market does represent the general state of the economy, whether we like it or not. Give or take your bull phase. If you look at that segment, a phenomenal amount of that has been driven by awareness. Because basically your retail investors that have come into the business have really come in there because over a period of time, the dissemination of news has communicated to them that there is a different segment to the economy, that the economy is booming. You're actually going into different segments of the economy. People are coming in there and talking to you. Otherwise, imagine the fact that you would, at any annual general report, annual general meeting, you would not even hear about it. You'd sometimes read a snippet of it in the newspaper, and you read an annual balance sheet 6 months after each company declared its dividend or its result. And today what you've got is quarter on quarter, you've got management being questioned, you've got an entire interactive process. So an element has come in where almost anyone in an educated society is looking at, therefore, media playing a very, very critical part, not just in the aspect of what insularly the industry is all about, but externally speaking completely, which is really that it's helping proliferate many other aspects and touching most aspects of the industry. If I were to move to the big screen and talk a little bit about the economy as far as that is concerned, but let me give you again where I think is a huge influence of the big screen. One of the biggest influences that cinema has anywhere else in the world is on tourism. Now, we've unfortunately had the reverse influence for people, because actually what's happened is that we've put our songs in Switzerland, Australia, so we've actually been pushing to get people to go visit Singapore. Well, the very fact that Yash Raj has been given an honor, Yash Chopra has been given an honorary status by the Prime Minister of Switzerland for tourism actually implies that they've thanked him for necessarily. So you can see the power and the instrument of that thought process. Most countries do it actually the reverse, and I think we're in the process of necessarily doing that. Because cinema is one of the best statements that you can talk about universally of the culture of your country, what it represents, the ethos, the family values, and in a very subtle manner, therefore destinations, locations, manner, and there's a chemistry. You can go necessarily to many cities in Europe, but you prefer to go to Rome because there's a certain sense of electricity, a certain sense of history, there's something that somebody's always read about it in some manner. So in each country, you definitely give through a pathos and a culture. And I think therefore, the big screen and the motion picture industry for any country is one of their best brand ambassadors of the overall nation as a whole. And I think that's an important aspect for us to bear, which is why we believe that actually media in India is mushrooming and growing primarily because we believe over a period of time, this is really the statements. And I think that's why in the beginning what you had is a combination of the movies. In the movie business was primarily very talented dream merchants. They would think of a story, they would figure out how to visualize it, they would figure out how to get the money from somewhere, and they would create their product. I think what you're learning here in the last 1 year or 2 years, depending on whether you're a one-year student and in life overall, you will find that there are mixed ingredients to any success of any product launch, any formula, anything that you're going for. And product is not about Hindustan Levers necessarily researching with a pear soap. It's got that right amount of fragrance or density or oil or whatever. But it's also the marketing, it's the distribution, it's the test markets, it's listening to the customer, it's coming back to that thought process. If you look at that, it's not very different than what we're doing necessarily now. But what was not being done for the last 100 years, but what has definitely been started to be happening in the overall big screen industry in the last 10 years, the last decade. And that's creating the difference. One, there is research, actual research that goes into most of everything. You'd be amazed to know the kind of research, like anything else that you look at, any service or product, whether it's a service industry like a hotel or an airline, to a product, you find that actually research is playing a very, very key role in almost anything that happens. for most of your big shows that you see on air, whether it's Indian Idol or whether it's the game shows or whatever, there's a tremendous amount of backdrop and research now that goes into that, which was not so as far as the industry. That's part of the way in which the industry is necessarily being corporatized, primarily with a mix of different kind of brains that are coming into the industry. Specialists who understand commercial. There's commercial acumen that is coming into almost every aspect of the media industry. And that's why you've seen a change over the last 4 or 5 years in the entire working, even on the big screen. What are the end results of that? An industry that otherwise had a statistic of 800 movies, but unfortunately at that time, almost 400 of those movies that got started never got completed. Because essentially what you had again was dream merchants who felt that there was no concept of a profit and loss and a cash flow. It was a question of, here I had a script and therefore let me just go out there. If I've got the first 2 crores of my 10 crore movie, I'm off. Now I'll figure out how the balance 8 crores comes. And if I don't, I'll shoot 2 songs, I'll educate everybody about that, I'll titillate everyone, and they say, wow, this sounds very good. Well, you want to know more? Well, you've got to give me another 8 crores. And that's how the industry worked. And essentially what happened was that because of that, you had a lot of stigma that went into the business. Because obviously you had borrowings at the rate of 32 and 48% of interest, which is not the returns that an industry like this was ever throwing up in the first place. Second, the entire concept of movie management was, after some time, cash flow, not P&L. Which means for any production company, which is a sole proprietor or a director, essentially to him, what advances he got was pretty much his entire P&L. There wasn't a concept of a P&L from that point. There wasn't a balance sheet. A balance sheet is, after I finish 5 movies, those are my assets. Those are the assets that can actually go into an inventory, and from that I can leverage. If I can leverage and go out and get bank debt from all points of view, those concepts were not really there, and that is really why a highly creative industry, really highly creative industry, lacked a commercial acumen, completely lacked marketing knowledge, and a very, very blinkered approach to distribution. There are 12,000 movie theaters in this country. Now, if you look at that in terms of statistics, one would be horrified, because actually there's more than that in the United States with 1/5 the population. So that's one benchmark. But if you look at the cup half full and half empty, China is 1/3 of the number of theaters that are in India. So in a sense, it all depends on how you look at that opportunity and go forward. We conducted a research about 9 months back when we started our distribution on these 12,000 theaters, where we wanted to understand literally the entire anatomy of each one, what were their facilities and whatever else. We found that on a pro rata basis, because we did it over 2,000 theaters, we found that 33% of the theaters actually are pretty much shut down. Of the balance 66%, almost half of that had major deficiencies, which means zero infrastructure in terms of air conditioning or any other cool air or breathing environment from that point of view, or every other alternative chair being broken, etc. So essentially you've got an exhibition business that is actually your end user. It's like saying that, again, you can actually have the best resort hotels, but if you don't have a road to that place, and you don't have any mode of transport to that place, you can talk about it as often as you want to, but you're not going to be able to sell that service. Or if you have a product, but you don't have a distribution network for that, you're going to have to go to somebody who's an expert. So that is something that over the last 4 or 5 years has completely changed. And what is now emerging is what we call the studio model. And when I say studio model, I don't mean real estate and a studio, so don't visualize it as an actual studio floor. The studio model is actually where an organization comes in and is involved in the production process, the marketing process, the distribution process, and to a certain extent the exhibition process. Exhibition is not mandatory in the entire model, and I'll just come to that and briefly explain to you why I believe so. Though there are many models that actually exist in an entirely horizontal integrated model, number one. Number two, you necessarily need to pre-plan. Essentially, this is an industry where if you leave it to just a sole proprietor or director, he's going to be as good as his movie. He's not got the sensibility to think of the next one, because actually that's what he's supposed to do, have the passion to complete that entire movie, release it, take 3 months off, and then figure out how he wants to do his next movie. So with the result that you have a cyclic process of almost 18 months. So if you look at the almost 30 or 35 listed companies in media today, and if 30 of them are dogs, it's primarily because during the 2000 boom, a lot of people raised a lot of money, because that was half the problem of the entrepreneur who asked for the money. And I think half the investment bankers promised them that money from that point, Because if you don't have a model that is scalable, that actually, if not monitors quarter to quarter, but at least monitors annually, it's not something that you can necessarily scale up. So essentially the studio model is to look at production and to look at it 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years ahead. So, for example, how we operate in UTV, it took us almost 2 years to understand this business. We went about, we started dabbling with just a small territory, which was Bombay territory, which includes part of Goa and a little bit of Karnataka and Western Maharashtra, and did distribution just to understand the territory. And we really figured out that it didn't make any sense. Because when you're going out as a distributor, the producer didn't want to show you the product because he was insecure that if you didn't like it, you'd turn him down and therefore not pay the price for it. So basically, he showed you the product pretty much 7 days before release. So essentially, you were crippled because from that point of view, you had no scope to figure out what was the marketing strategy. And number 3, what is going to be my distribution strategy? Should I show it in a single screen with 1,000 theaters, or should I show it at INOX with 200 seats? Should I show it with 200 prints nationwide, or should I actually start with 20 prints and build it up to 800 prints from that point? All of these apply now over a period of time because, and we felt therefore that the only way we could enter a business was to be in the studio model, which means that if we weren't in control of production, we didn't want to get into distribution. And if we weren't in control of distribution, we didn't want to get into production. Because from that point of view, those were the integral parts necessary. And I think that's how the business over the next 5 years in the big screen is going to evolve. Primarily for the entire studio model, not anything else but that you are in complete control. Now that does not mean that the individuals are out. In fact, they're very much in. They're in a collaborative effort of the model that works. So essentially what you have is a studio model working with dream merchants and working out necessarily how the partnership works from that point of view. And the partnership doesn't have to necessarily be in a structured manner. It can be in an alliance, it can be a joint venture, it could be any of those situations. One of the most prolific directors, Steven Spielberg, aligned himself with Universal Studios for 10 years. Essentially what did he have? He had the freedom to decide to do and do the creative work the way he felt best. He had a grant of about $4 or $5 million every year as a budget to do his seeding work of developing concepts, researching them, scrapping them, whatever else. And he knew that once he had the idea and that was greenlit, somebody would handle the production, somebody would handle the finances, and marketing and distribution would be taken care of by Universal Studios. That's the kind of partnership and model that took Hollywood to become a $12 billion industry. The exhibition part of the business, which has now become a big fancy and interest here, and is almost becoming the independent industry here, is partly again by the necessity of the fact that what we've had is a very crippling infrastructure, partly because of high entertainment tax regimes. So pretty much till about 20 years back, 15 years back, when we had 98% taxation, income taxation, and then 4% wealth tax, so basically whatever you earn, you were paying the government to work, is pretty much what necessarily was there almost 4 or 5 years back. Entertainment tax was 95% and 100% from that point of view. So you had a compulsion for almost everyone in the entire value chain to go through an under-declaration. I think that's changed to a certain extent, and the average entertainment tax bill now is 35% nationwide. You still have states with 70%, but most of them are on the 15 and 25% brackets. The average comes to about 45%. 2, the government is recognizing the fact that investment into infrastructure is critical. And therefore, when you're investing into that infrastructure, we're going to give you a 5-year tax holiday, like they did with the Pondicherry, or they did with the Daman UTV, or they did in a particular industry or a small-scale industry. To that extent, they've actually realized that if you don't have this infrastructure in the back end, you're not necessarily going to be able to proliferate content and bring that about. And I think that's why, to a certain extent, this has been looked at as an industry. For a business model overall, you need to understand that this is the least sexy part of the business, because primarily it's a real estate business. It's also a capacity utilization business. Again, in the US, you will find that most of the media companies that started by doing film production and distribution had to, during the 1920s and 30s, go into exhibition because there wasn't any technology, there wasn't any venues where they could actually show their movies, and therefore they needed to go out and build those theaters. But the minute they could exit from that, most of your big majors, whether it's a Time Warner or a News Corporation or a Viacom or a Disney, they're not in the exhibition part of the business. Because that actually makes, it's a question of whether the tail wags the dog or the dog wags the tail. And in this case, they definitely felt that if I have infrastructure of 4,000 theaters, then I'll be compelled to make more content than I need to start feeding these pipelines in. And that was not something that they wanted to do. So over a period of time, I think we're going through the 1930s and 1940s of a developed country places when it comes to exhibition. But at the end of the day, it is a capacity game and a capacity utilization basis. The break-even model in the US is 6 to 7% occupancy for theaters. Now, it's not that alarming because basically what happens is it's almost down to 1% and 2% on weekdays and goes up to 100% on the opening night or otherwise 40% on weekends for theaters. And at the end of the day, outside of being a real estate business, it's a popcorn business. Because in any movie, in any theater complex or exhibition, you will find that 55% of the revenues comes from ticket sales and 45% comes from F&B. And if your content is not very good, 55% comes from F&B and 45% comes from that. The people are obviously standing out more in the theater and buying some snacks and popcorn or somebody else wants to watch the theater. So that's the economics of necessarily that. Lastly, let me just touch on what I believe over the next couple of years, the influence of technology is going to still change this already industry that is evolving. If I were to summarize, therefore, in the entire small screen and cable television business, you will find that one of the key situations is how to capture the entire revenues and organize the cable industry is going to be the biggest challenge. And if you can do that, you will find a huge boom as far as this broadcasting industry is concerned. And something almost where you ain't seen anything yet. Because then what will happen is models of actual niche channels will come about. Today, the reason why in a developed country you can have a channel that just does squash or a golfing channel is primarily because they get a pay revenue. So if I believe through research that I can have 1 million subscribers in India who are interested in golf or interested in yoga from that point of view, and if I can charge them 20 rupees, and that's my business model, I don't need to worry about the advertising revenues. Today, the broadcasters work with almost 80% coming from advertising and 20% coming from pay. Sports channels may vary from time to time where it becomes 60-40 by and large. In an ideal environment, the business model in broadcasting is 50-50. 50 from advertising and 50 necessarily from cable revenues. At this point, till technology changes us and takes us to the next level. Which is why you have now, and that's the technology point that I want to bring about in television, is what you call the DTH, which is the direct to home. Essentially, it's nothing more than skipping the cable operator. There's nothing else more to that technology. And of course, a high resolution product because it's digital in nature. So essentially, you buy a box. And with that, you get captive channels that are being fed by that operator. Again, it is normally a luxury item. So if you have 100 million cable homes in the US, you actually have only 10 million DTH homes. That situation could actually become the reversed here. Because primarily, for most people who actually believe that they want to get out of the cable operator syndrome from that point of view, get their choice. Because today, whether you like it or not, you can go home and necessarily what you thought was on channel 4 is now being changed by the cable operator completely. So when a news channel calls its channel 7, I'm not sure why they did that, because there's no way they're going to be channel 7 on every single place. Whereas anywhere else, if you look at it, in any mature environment, when you call a channel even by a number, that's the slot that you're going to get necessarily from the cable operator. So I think DTH is going to evolve and bring about a completely different segment of audience. It will involve a lot more investment. Now, a normal consumer will say, why am I going to pay 7,000 rupees for a box and maybe 250 rupees unless the content is compelling? The answer is not many people will subscribe. Primarily because you have 180 channels for which you're anyway paying 75 rupees. So unless the government decides that they're going to do a very unsocialistic thing by bringing about this regulation, which is half the reason why this regulation got scuppered, is because there isn't a government that wants to actually figure out, because it is the largest form of mass entertainment. Outside of movies, which today is still a 20 to 30 rupee ticket on an average, not counting your INOX here but anywhere else on an average, 20 to 30 rupees, you get 4 hours of air-conditioned comfort. And the movie theaters, and the movies that ran at that time for 3.5 and 4 hours as duration was not because the creative person, it was primarily also because the creative person did not tell a story in the right period of time, but it was also because they felt that for most people, paying 30 rupees and sitting in an air-conditioned environment for 4 hours was part of the entire process and a part of the value for money proposition. And that's how the entire culture and the evolution of that duration that we're now fighting with. And how do we fight that through? We need to tell our stories more crisply and we need to say it with less songs from that point. So I think especially in the small screen, I think DTH is going to change a fair amount of that. And other delivery platforms like broadband. But I believe we're still 4 or 5 years away from that. There is fiber optic that has been laid by some of the biggest companies in the world and in India. Reliance has done a phenomenal amount of work with that. Enron has done a fair amount of work on that. And many other companies have actually joint ventured and done a tremendous amount of fiber optic in this entire. So you've got literally, if you look at the map of India, the entire trunk routes are laid. But they're going to have the most biggest bottleneck that anyone's ever faced, which is what is called the last mile, which is what the present cable operator today controls. And until you break that last mile, nobody is going to be able to make any sense of that thought process. And you're not just blocking entertainment. You're blocking telephony. You're blocking internet. You're blocking broadband. You're blocking two-way communication of any form, interactive or otherwise, which is what the entire fiber optic has been laid. We are much more high-tech fiber optic laid than the United States of America. More fiber optic has been laid in this country with a little less investment necessarily than it happened in the US. One of the best examples there I can give you is AT&T, which was a telephone company, and then they decided technology was going to change, broadband, internet, whatever else, and part of the push and pull. And they took their biggest gamble ever by buying the largest cable operator in the United States with $30 billion US. But they were 5 years before their time for actually using the cable system for telephony, broadband, and interactive. And that's pretty much why AT&T today is not one of the most valued brands, valued customers, valued companies, whereas actually it was going to take that one leap. Major strategic decisions, you take Time Warner that are under intense pressure that says new economy, old economy. It was the buzzword, and everyone thought that was the entire buzzword. New economy, old economy, merged with AOL. And since then, all they've had is nothing but problems from that point of view. So, timing in technology is one of the most important aspects, because when you look at it, it sounds so futuristic that you'll be damned if you don't want to participate. But the critical part of almost any business decision, and this doesn't apply necessarily to media, but I think anywhere else, is the question of a huge difference and an identification of whether you want to pioneer something or whether you're before your time. And I think that's the segmentation you need to do on almost any aspect, any business decision you're making as a professional, in a banking career, or in any other career. I think the key differentiation when you're in an innovative business is to actually being able to take that tough call that am I pioneering, which in itself is hugely difficult because you're obviously trotting a path not trodden before. Get trodden by little, not trodden before. And will that actually outcome in saying, I'll have a first mover advantage, or I'm before my time? And if you're before your time, there's not much in your business plan or in your thinking that you could have done. Yes, a fair amount of research will tell you whether you're before your time or not. But when you're looking at technology, and today almost everything is moving at that rapid pace, there's a tremendous amount of competitive pressure in any aspect of any business that we do, which is actually forcing us to take decisions faster, with maybe less thinking, less research to that extent, only because we need to be up and with the pace. That's one of the key differentiations that I think, that's just a general observation and a huge learning that has happened necessarily for our company and me personally, is constantly being able to now differentiate between pioneering, which is very important. And sometimes I believe in today's industry, there's no real harm in being the second person, because you could actually be learning a lot from the other person who's come in there. But if he's moved too far away and had too much of a strong first mover advantage, then you're going to take almost 5 to 10 years to necessarily catch up. So those are some of the differentiations that actually happen when you look at the entire aspects. In the motion picture industry, I think the studio model is what's going to make the change. Completely and absolutely. That means commerce, marketing is going to combine with creativity to actually make this 5,000 crore industry, 4,500 to 5,000 crore industry grow at possibly 30 to 40%. Because the minute you do that, you're taking content that today, if a movie is average and makes 10 crores in terms of gross revenue at the box office, now you're finding out that the potential of that with right marketing and distribution, even for average content, is actually 20 crores. It's 100% more. And that's primarily because of marketing strategy. Let me give you an example of marketing strategy. I think one of these science fiction movies, I forget what the name is, that Columbia right now did a sequel of. No, I think the one with the speed actor. Matrix. Okay, so when they did Matrix, they looked at the movie and they decided in one shot, clearly and absolutely, this was not a movie that was going to run. Matrix, the original, the Matrix, not Matrix 2. They went out there and released 5,000 prints. Because the entire brand name matrix is so high, they did almost a $60 to $70 million box office on the opening weekend from that point of view. The movie did not do as well as Matrix 2 from that point of view. It was definitely much less successful. But marketing and distribution strategy was different. They found an average product and they decided how I'm going to put it into the market before anyone else and bump up the jam and go forward as far as that's concerned. So it's a combination of all of that. I think the brand names here of Avanti and Bubbly, in many aspects, if you look at the overall, it's a different niche of a film. It's a fun caper, but it's not a content that it had not come from the Yash Raj stable. It would have been something that everyone would stand out and say, this is going to be a huge box office hit. But a tremendous amount of 6 months of build-up on marketing, and intrigue value in that process, and a huge initial process came about there. Now, for most people here, everyone would look at a movie like Mangal Pandey and say, well, I'm going to come back after 4 years. But I would say if I took a poll here of how many people actually thought, what's your perception? Is the movie is a success if you raise your hand, and flop if you raise your hand? How many of you all think it's a success? Just a perception. How many of you all think it's a flop? Okay, so let me just tell you, Mangal Pandey is the largest box office opening in India. Largest. Okay, 18.5 crores in terms of theatrical box office just in India. Similarly in some other places from that point. Therefore the strategy of that movie was, as a historical movie, I think people are looking at more bunties and bubblies, the no entries and the David Dhawans from that point of view. This is not an era where you want to see one more national, and Mangal Pandey from all points of view didn't have a pull factor. I think people wanted to see more Aamir than the story of Mangal Pandey as compared to people who want to see more about Gandhi than Ben Kingsley 20 years back. So if you look at that as an example, what happened here was an incredible amount of 30 days of absolute carpet bombing of marketing. And again, the jury's out because over-marketing of film is creating overhype. So here was an ideal example if you look at in marketing learning lessons. To a certain extent, again, it's a half-half and a 50-50 ratio. If it hadn't been hyped to the extent it had, it wouldn't have recovered the overall investment that it had in the film. On the flip side, it may have been a little bit more perceived as a commercial success. And I think some of you all would have raised your hands here that Mangal Pandey was a success, because half the reason is that the marketing was way beyond the actual delivery. So essentially what happened is there was so much hype on the film. And that again, as much as pioneering versus before your time, again, too much of marketing, creating a hype and expectancy on a product, service, content, whatever that would be, is a huge learning curve to strike that right necessary balance. But to come back to the studio model, I think that's really what will make the difference. Today, directors are understanding that outside of script, marketing and distribution strategy, all three are the core parameters for success. Besides, of course, the fact that the commercial aspects, the financial aspects are coming to this business. Most people look at film industry and start talking about corporatizing it. They're all talking about the wrong meaning. They're talking about the fact that everyone has to make a balance sheet so that IDBI and UTI can give it loans. That's immaterial. That's really not any essence of corporatization when it comes to the film industry. What it needs is the striking the right balance between content, marketing, and distribution. And I think that's really the key part for that. Technology-wise, I do believe that India is at a good cusp of being able to harness what it... And again here, some of our technologies are going to be pushed by content. So again, you do have a problem with the last mile here. And actually most of your people feel, why don't we have the kind of broadband connectivity that you do have? It is primarily because of the cable distribution pattern here. Because most of the people, the kind of investments they've made, they don't want to come into the household with only broadband. They want to come in there with telephoning. They want to come in there with entertainment. They want to come in with two-way interaction from that perspective. And that's not necessarily happening as you go forward. So I think the next 2-3 years, but you look at the mobile industry and you'll find out again, it's something which is a huge example of the right kind of marketing, then the right kind of pricing that has opened up the entire situation. And 3 years back, we were one of the most expensive countries in the world for phone, besides the fact that you couldn't get a phone landline for almost a year anywhere in the country, we were also one of the most expensive in terms of making international calls or domestic calls. And now on the mobile basis, we're the cheapest in the world, the cheapest by far. China went to almost 80 million or 100 million in terms of mobile connectivity, but we're now growing at the rate of 24 million new subscribers a year, which is the highest. So 2005, we will be the #1 country in the world in terms of growth in terms of mobile technology. 24 million new subscribers, which is huge. These are That's the size of the European market over the next 5 years and 10 years. And that's why you find that there is a mushrooming of, you don't need to necessarily have a 200 middle class evolving to get into these if the price bands are necessarily right. And that's the influx point that you will find in some of the media parts of our business necessarily too. Lastly, in the technology part, I think one more example is the direct-to-home video, direct-to-video. Statistically, again, DVD or DVD recorders in this country were primarily, the audience reaction is you've been so used to pirated content that actually our basic need to watch programs or watch anything in content which is necessarily pirated is something that we are used to. So basically you're watching things at half the quality that most people otherwise are used to. There's a certain high level of tolerance. Second, you don't have hardware like DVD recorders that are almost as expensive as 10,000 rupees, which is now crashed to as low as 1,500. So again, what's happened in the entire mobile industry? China went from 5 million DVD recorders to 100 million in about 3 years, and primarily on pricing because of the volume. If that can happen in a country like India, where we can go from about a present population of 9 million recorders in DVD and VCD, and VCD is a fast getting obsolete industry, you will find that if that goes to 100 million, you've opened up another Pandora's box in terms of where this industry could necessarily grow. So if you look at the opportunities, yes, combined the electronic media is about a 25 to 30,000 crore industry. You add a little bit of the emerging industries like music, which is going through its own doldrums. And how do we take that to 100,000 crores industry? And I think one, regulation and a certain amount of systemization in the broadcasting and capturing revenues on the cable side and DTH. In the movie industry to grow an international demand and make the studio model come in. And three, technology in broadband, technology in two-way interactive processing content when it comes to residential and hotels and other leisure industries, and the direct-to-home video market. I think that's the sort of overview that I can put forward on a Saturday evening where I think otherwise everyone's going to beer up there, dumping down. So I think I'll pause at that and be very happy to take as many Q&As as possible. The reason the problem with the last mile today is that the last mile into the residential building is right now the prerogative of the cable operator. And that is not fiber optic. That's a very minuscule, technically called an RG11AU cable, which is not two-way firstly. And anything that you want to do with fiber optic has to be two-way. And that is something that the cable operator is not allowing people, through various pressure tactics, politics, mafia, and many others, to actually get into the business. So that's one. And two, the government hasn't licensed it. So because there isn't an actual, they've licensed telephone. You want to take a radio station today, you need to pay the license fee for 10 years. But they haven't actually licensed the entire concept of the cable television. So when they do that, right now it's being prevented to do that. Large corporations, including News Corp and Star TV, bought into a cable network whose job was to aggregate all the cable networks and buy them over. That hasn't helped either. People have put in almost 2,000 crores into this activity of acquisition of the cable network, but it hasn't paid. It's all gone down the drain. And third, what most fiber optic people are going to find, which is a big surprise, is that the actual last mile technology investments is going to be almost as big as the fiber optic investment nationwide.
So, I mean, what is it? Is it, I mean, if companies like Reliance have a fiber optic network in place, is it because of political pressure, I mean, political manipulation is real, they can't do it, or is it because it's a combination of investment?
It's employing a huge amount of people, it's generating a lot of parallel economy money completely. In most places, the politicians are completely involved with that nexus in terms of cable operators from that point of view. I think that's really the key part. And consolidation is not something that's going to be that easy, because for 20 years it's an ingrained culture of doing so. So that's really, I mean, if you look at it, there is a fair amount of money, and if you look at Reliance again, take that example in the phone industry, they went in there and they broke the codes across the board in terms of volume, in terms of rate. But they did have a cost. They had 4,000 crores they wrote off in bad debts, so people never paid for their mobiles. So you take an industrial giant, for them to move and start understanding the consumer and a retailer as compared to dealing with an IOC and a Bharat Petroleum is a whole new ballgame. And that's what I think people are dealing with.
It's something they have to get into.
Yeah, which is why I'm saying it will take another 4 to 5 years. Unless a strong government, preferably not a coalition government, actually takes that hard call and says this is a regulation. Which is what they were planning to do. The BJP government did do that for that first couple.
terms of content, if you look at the US film industry, you have say independent cinema, you have mainstream cinema, then art house movies, and also crossover movies. But when it comes to the Indian film industry, you don't see that kind of a diverse content. So how do you see this particular content being regulated in the future, and at the same time making it profitable?
Yeah, I see it actually emerging. If you see the last 3 years as compared to the last 30 years, you pretty much have answered the question in that thought process. If you see the last 3 years, you have seen breakout movies at 1 crore and 2 crores and 3 crores being made. So alternative cinema, if not art house cinema. Art house cinema is pretty much there. You haven't heard about that, but it's pretty prevalent.
But it's
National
profitable, right? It's not really profitable. You don't
No.
see that.
No, it's not. But I can tell you in the art house films necessarily in Hollywood are also not profitable. It's not necessarily. It's a different kind of a contest. It's brand building for an organization, for distribution companies. Most art house films are done through government grants. UK, France, Canada, all these people give huge government grants. In fact, the US is so out of kilter that they're now giving government grants. If you shoot in New York, if you shoot whatever you shoot, 20% the exchequer will give you a check of your entire budget. So art house films are not necessarily, mostly not profitable, but you do have a Fahrenheit 9/11, and there's one more, actually one on penguins. National Geographic and Universal Studios released just about 4 months back that has crossed the $25 million benchmark. But 99 out of 100 would not make money. It would either be through government grants or it would be necessary for the brand building of a particular organization distribution system. But to come back to India again here, in the last 3 years there's a huge change that's necessarily happening. So a movie like Iqbal that can be made and many others, and there are lots of examples of that, can actually come about primarily because now there is scope for experimentation, number one. And two, there is a confidence level with people that this content will travel slowly over a period of time. So therefore, what used to be 95% of revenue used to come from Indian theatrical domestic box office. Now that has gone down to 60%, that component. And the balance 40% is DVD, television, satellite, international rights, and many others. Slowly that coefficient will come down to 40%. And that is the reason why you'll find parallel cinema actually mushrooming that segment.
So this is regarding the marketing aspects of the movies. There are movies like Black, which build up totally on the basis of word of mouth publicity. So why do you think the marketing is so much important in the movies when the word of mouth is so strong, so prevalent? There are movies like Iqbal, means they are building up totally on the basis of word of mouth.
Yes.
So I think the marketing, if you over market the movie, it can backfire.
I agree with you that over marketing the movie can backfire. Second is there is always an element that the biggest challenge in a movie is to first get people to come to the movie theatre to see it from that point of view. There's a movie that we produced that we are very proud of, but overall commercially didn't do as well as we thought it would, was Swades. Our biggest challenge there was necessarily it was an offbeat movie, but it had Shah Rukh Khan, so from that point of view it was as mass as you could get. But the fact of the matter is that it appealed in the United States and UK, it appealed in some segments here. But our big challenge was, before word of mouth takes over, how do we get people to the theatre and necessarily see that? If they feel, oh, this is going to be a period film, there's an aversion to that process. So marketing, to get people for the opening weekend is what I mean is very critical. And for the industry as such, it's so critical because it was 0 before. So even to come on 5 on 10 is an important aspect of that. But I fully agree with you, after 3 days, no amount of marketing is going to be able to salvage or push your product. It is only word of mouth.
I think so Black is the best example of word of mouth publicity. It's totally built up on the basis of word of mouth.
Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. It started at this level at box office, and most movies start here and then go like that. It went on that basis. Yep, absolutely correct.
To what extent are the directors willing to go and talk about the studio model and actually taking their product and marketing it? To what extent are they willing to relinquish that creative decision making, a strong word? Because you're talking about marketing in the normal product marketing sense.
Yeah.
When you're talking about marketing in the studio model, you take a product and you do your whatever.
Yeah.
So
Very much so. I think people are now beginning to do that from that point of view. And I think directors are understanding the importance of that process because it's critical. They've seen benefits and results coming from good marketing and good distribution strategies. So people are not averse to that. The main problem of them not being in the past comfortable was their aversion to show their product because of their insecurity that if somebody doesn't like my product, they won't pick it up. Because his value chain stopped at the distributor. So at the end of the day, a creative director is making his film for his immediate target audience, which was 8 distributors in India and 1 internationally and 1 satellite channel. When the minute the studio model comes in, that risk component is the studios. If I have the conviction to produce the movie, I better have the conviction to distribute it myself. That model wasn't prepared. So with that model, there's a forced awareness that says, let's do it together.
Like, I don't know, like, the movie which is released on Fridays in India, normally, is it the same in London or?
It's day and date everywhere in the world.
How is it managed, the entire supply process?
Well, actually, it's a very simple, no rocket science, very simple. Indian movies, well, I'd say Hindi movies, not Indian movies, go to about 20 to 25 countries worldwide. Tamil movies go to about 5 or 6. Most of the other movies are mostly DVD releases. The component right now is that if you release 400 prints in India, you would release about 200 to 250. That's the proportion, 60 to 40 ratio internationally. They all get done completely day and date. So by the Monday before the Friday is when everything goes across, because you need to actually get them sent to each of these countries. So there's a fair amount of logistics that go into that, and they go straight to the movie theaters like anything else that goes straight from a courier company. There's absolutely no rocket science. I think the only place where it gets released before a Friday is in Dubai. It gets released on Wednesday. I think everyone's trying to change that. The maximum reply is coming. That only because they have a Thursday, Saturday, and not a Saturday, Sunday. That's the only reason. Here is about 40 to 50 rupees, though at the complete mass level is 20 to 30. The average pricing there is 350 to 400 rupees. So in value terms, your international territory, if 10 million people see a movie here, but only 2 million people see it there, the possibility of the revenues being almost the same are very high. Plus, taxation in those countries is very low, and cable tax.
So it's their law of land which determines the price.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You can't dictate from India the price.
No. I mean, basically, worldwide, the average ticket of a price is between $6 to $9, $6 to $8 worldwide. That's pretty much it. Including, you'll be surprised to know China. China is not $1. China is $7 to see movies here, which is maybe part of the reason why this movie price.
Well, we are the lowest in terms of, we are a
The largest form of mass entertainment for the masses.
And the second one is, India is having around 800 movie releases per year, roughly all the languages. But why the content, the quality of the movies is not comparable to international standards. When you compete in international film festivals, you hardly see any Indian movie releases.
Primarily, a little bit of that is because of culture. So I would not agree in the last 2 to 3 years. If you see some of the production values in movies that are coming out here, they're pretty much world class. We have world class directors here. Sanjay Leela Bhansali, Vinod Chopra, many actors go along the whole list. They're world class directors. If you gave them a movie to do with Jackie Chan and Mel Gibson, they'd be able to come up with the same product. You give them a $30 million budget versus a $3 million budget, you do a better job than many of the directors there. So we have world class talent. I think if you're other than Hollywood, if you compare it to French theatre, UK theatre is dead. England, being a prolific and one of the largest economies, is almost a dead market. They're actually giving grants and forcing people to run festivals. Why our movies don't make it necessary into festivals is a cultural situation. Primarily to do with, we're very insular in our approach to our culture, which is changing. And second is the duration. So, even though a movie like Lagan did get nominated, and frankly, if you get nominated to the top 5 at the Oscars, you're pretty much, it's like you won an Oscar. Okay, because out of 55 nominations, if you're in the top 5, it's almost on these lists from that point of view. Pretty much you have won an Oscar. And the only reason why I didn't finally take away that Oscar is the resistance that the director Ashutosh Gavarekar and the star cast, including Ahmed, who camped in Los Angeles for 45 days, they couldn't get the Academy people to come. They actually gave them limos from their house to the theatre. They didn't want to come and see a 3.5-hour movie. They just didn't want to see a 3.5-hour movie. So it's those kind of things, and I think that's changing. But as far as talent is concerned, as far as production values are concerned, given the budgets, they're improved. See, if you do a comedy genre, so if you take Maine Pyar Tu Kiya and try and compare the Why is it not world class, but then you've got to take it with 5 other comedy serials that come out, comedy programs or comedy movies that come out from anywhere in the world. In fact, those are much more slapstick than the ones that we get. Yeah.
So the studio model that you are referring to, would it be similar to the 20th Century Fox and Universal Studios that is there in Hollywood? If it is different, how would it be?
They will be pretty much absolutely the same. They're the people who are creative catalysts who manage the creative talent, but know exactly when to pull back. And there's a script, there's a process, there's research, and then it's one person's vision. It can't be 5 people's vision, especially in a creative product. And that is a respect that you need to. And then all the support structure that goes around it is pretty much what a studio model is. And I think the model, for example, what we are following, is pretty much what is in the Western countries.
What's the timeline you see when that is going to happen in India?
It's happening as we talk from that point of view. It is happening as we talk. I think our model, Yashraj's model, I would have said not many others, but now Atlas, because Reliance go with. And that's how it works.
Tell us the UTV story. How you found it?
We're already at 8 o'clock. But I think, okay, maybe I'll come back to that and sum that up in 5 minutes. Let me take a few more questions and then come back.
Just one more question.
Sure.
You have gotten to starting a channel of your own in Hangama TV. The content in Hangama TV differs from that across. Do you see yourself as pioneering before your time, or where do you see yourself? Primarily because it's based entirely for children between 4 to 14. The only thing is that you're not having cartoon, you have replacing with live action. So in that sense, do you see?
Yeah. Well, between 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. when I'm in my shower and thinking at home, I think it's before it's time. After 9 o'clock when I sit down and work with the rest of the team people, I think I'm being pioneering. That's really the answer. Because it's a fine line. The reason is that basically, again, we strongly believe that content will drive demand as you go forward. And basically the kids segment, if you look at the statistics, 60